Every 4 years, the most competitive presidential election states are labeled the battlegrounds. It's where campaigns spend the most money and give the most attention. But new analysis shows those battleground states are not as competitive for congressional races. The analysis from Ohio State University was first reported by Axios. It found many of the most competitive states in the 2020 presidential election are home to some of the least competitive House districts. Researchers say that could be a sign of gerrymandering. Axios politics reporter Stef Kight joins me now with more on her reporting. Welcome, Stef. So this is really interesting when you look at that map and you see those battleground states and you look further into the data. Tell us, first of all, more about what this data means and why it matters.
Yeah, so what these researchers did was they looked at the margins between President Biden and former President Trump in the 2020 election in each congressional district. Then they created an average for each state, so the average margin in their districts. They then compared that to the state overalls, which allows them to kind of see a gap between the competitiveness of the state and the competitiveness of the districts. And this is a really important way to look at whether the lines are drawn fairly or whether maybe congressional districts are made intentionally less competitive to benefit one party or the other.
So what states did researchers find had the biggest discrepancy between state competitiveness and district competitiveness?
The big states were Georgia, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Wisconsin, and Arizona. And of course, all 5 of those states are states that were key players in the 2020 presidential election. They're battleground states that people are watching very closely. And so that made it even more important for states to really dig into why we're seeing this discrepancy, because these are some of the most competitive states and they're some of the most important states for electoral outcomes. And so the fact that their districts are not as competitive raises questions to researchers, and it's questions that they think Congress should be looking into as well.
So does the research show who benefited the most from those gaps in competitiveness?
Well, there are a couple of ways to look at that. If you look at some of the states like Georgia, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Wisconsin, they have more Republican members of Congress than Democrats, or about the same. So that seems to indicate that Republicans are the ones benefiting from this. Republicans also control redistricting in some of those states, which is another sign that they could be using that power to create districts that favor them. And even in Georgia, if you look at the Republican districts versus the Democratic districts, the Republican districts are safer. They're easier for Republicans to win than the Democratic districts, which again points to Republicans maybe having the upper hand in those states. Arizona was the only one that when I spoke to Edward Foley, who was leading this project, he said Arizona's lines may actually benefit Democrats a little bit more.
Interesting. So what concerns do researchers have about this besides gerrymandering?
Well, if for some reason this is not due to gerrymandering, if this is merely the fact that states are trying to adhere to the Voting Rights Act, they're trying to keep cities together and rural counties together, then we have a different problem. We're seeing competitiveness disappear, and this could actually give rise to more politically extreme candidates. If you create a district that's extremely red or extremely blue, we may increasingly see candidates who can thrive there who are on the more political extremes. So again, pushing the country into a more partisan direction. And this was something that the researchers I spoke to said, we need to ask ourselves, is that what we want? And do we want to make sure that we're putting, boundaries on that? Do we make sure that states do keep their districts competitive to a certain extent to prevent the parties moving too far into the extremes?
Yeah, I mean, with that in mind, Stef, did the researcher you spoke with suggest any ways these gaps could be narrowed?
Well, he offered a few ideas for Congress. He was saying that perhaps Congress could pass a law that would force states to have their maps looked at, get pre-clearance from the Justice Department or a federal court when you see these large discrepancies, when you see these competitive gaps in a state. It should trigger a pre-clearance, that they have to go get those maps looked at. They have to explain why those discrepancies exist and put that burden on states to explain their maps. and then move forward. And if they can't explain it, to have them redraw those maps. He also was saying Congress could pass a law that merely makes it easier for other groups to bring lawsuits when we do see these gaps, to provide another avenue for lawyers and parties to bring lawsuits over maps when they see these trends. And again, it's not saying that this definitely means that there's gerrymandering, but what the researchers said was we should at least be looking at this and allow people to raise their concerns when we see these gaps.
Right. It's an important conversation to have, especially at a time when, folks are asking how exactly did things get so polarized, not just at the national level, but when you look locally at these states as well. Stef Kight, Stef, thanks very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.